as you all know, we've just spent billions of dollars, quite rightly, in trying to understand the human genome. And that's just one species, that's just us. And we've come to understand and realize how incredibly valuable this information is. And we've never understood kind of how it all worked together before, because before we had, let me put it this way. In the past, we've done science by taking things apart to see how they work. And it's led to extraordinary discoveries, extraordinary degrees of understanding. But the problem with taking things apart to see how they work is, even though it gets you down to the sort of fundamental particles, the fundamental principles, the fundamental forces at work, we still don't really understand how they work until we see them in motion. One of the things that came about as a result of understanding these fundamental principles was we came to invent this thing called the computer. And the great thing about the computer is that unlike every previous analytical tool, and there have been, it's funny how many of these have to do with glass. When we first came across glass, which is, is a form of sand, and we invented lenses, and we looked up into the sky, and we discovered from that, by studying the sky, we began to discover fundamental things about gravity, and we also discovered that the universe seems to consist, terrifyingly enough, almost entirely of nothing. The next thing we did with glass was we put them in microscopes, and we looked down into this very, very, very solid world around us, and we see the fundamental particles there, the atoms made up of protons and neutrons with electrons spinning around them. We also discover that they seem to consist, frighteningly, almost entirely of nothing. And that even where you do find something, it turns out it isn't actually there, it isn't actually a thing there, merely the possibility that there may be something there. It kind of doesn't feel quite as real as this. So it's only when the next thing that we do with sand, with silicon, is we create the computer. And this finally enables us to start putting things together to see how they work. And it allows us to see actual process at work. And we begin to see how very, very simple things lead inexorably by iteration after iteration to enormously complex processes emerging and blossoming. And to my mind, one of the most extraordinary things of our age, I mean, those of us who are around will remember, seeing man walking on the moon for the first time, but I think the most dramatic and extraordinary thing that we have seen in our time is being able to see on computer screens the process by which enormously simple, primitive things, processes, instructions, repeated many, many times over, very, very fast and iterated over a generation of instructions, produce enormously complex results. So that we can suddenly start to create, just out of fundamentally simple, primitive instructions, we can create the way in which a wind behaves in a wind tunnel, the turbulence of wind. We can see how light might dance in an imaginary dinosaur's eye. And we do it all out of fundamentally simple instructions. And as a result of that, we have finally come to an understanding of the way in which life has actually emerged. Now, there are an awful lot of things we don't know about life. But any life scientist will tell you that although there's an awful lot we don't know, there is no longer a deep mystery. There's no longer a deep mystery because we have actually seen with our own eyes the way in which simplicity gives rise to complexity. So that when I say there's no mystery, it's rather as if you imagine taking a detective from the 19th century teaming him up with a detective from the late 20th century, and giving them this problem to work on, that a suspect in a crime was seen one day to be walking down the street in the middle of London, and the next day was seen somewhere out in the desert in the middle of New Mexico. Now, the 19th century detective will say, well, I haven't the faintest idea. I mean, it must be some species of magic has happened. And he would have no idea about how to begin to solve what has happened here. For the 20th century detective, now, he may never know whether the guy went on British Airways or United or American or where he hired his car from or all that kind of stuff. He may never find those details, but there won't be any fundamental mystery about what has happened. So for us, there's no longer a fundamental mystery about life. It is all the process of extraordinary eruptions of information. And it's information that gives us this fantastically rich, complex world in which we live. But at the same time that we've discovered that, we are destroying it at a rate that has no precedent in history, unless you go back to the point that we're hit by an asteroid. So there is a kind of terrible irony that at the point that we are best able to understand and appreciate and value the richness of life around us, we are destroying it at a higher rate than has ever been destroyed before. And we are losing species after species after species, day after day, just because we're burning the stuff down for firewood. And this is a kind of terrible indictment of our understanding. But you see, we make another mistake because we think somehow this is all right in some fundamental kind of way, because we think that this is all sort of meant to happen. Now, let me explain how we get into that kind of mindset, because it's exactly the same kind of mindset that the Kakapo gets trapped in, because what has been a very successful strategy for the Kakapo over generation after generation, for thousands and thousands of years, suddenly is the wrong strategy, and he has no means of knowing, because he's just doing what has been successful up till then. And we have always been, because we're tool makers, because we take from our environment the stuff that we need to do what we want to do, and it's always been very successful for us. I'll tell you what's happened. It's as if we've actually kind of put the sort of pause button on our own process of evolution, because we have put a buffer around us, which consists of medicine and education and buildings and all these kinds of things that protect us from the normal environmental pressures. And it's our ability to make tools that enables us to do this. Now, generally speaking, what drives speciation is if a small group of animals gets separated out from the main body by population pressure, some geographical upheaval or whatever. So imagine a small bunch suddenly finds itself stranded in a slightly colder environment. Then you know over a small number of generations, then those genes that favor a thicker coat will come to the fore, and you come back a few generations later, the animal's got a thicker coat. Man, because we are able to make tools, we arrive in a new environment where it's much colder, and we don't have to wait for that process, because we see an animal that's already got a thicker coat, we say we'll have it off him. And so we've kind of taken control of our environment, and that's all very well. But we need to be able to sort of rise above that process of. We have to rise above that vision and see a higher vision and see and understand the effect we're actually having. Now, imagine, if you will, an early man, and let's just sort of see how this sort of mindset comes about. He's standing, surveying his world at the end of the day, and he looks at it and thinks, this is a very wonderful world I find myself in. This is pretty good. I mean, look, behind me is the mountains, and the mountains are great because there are caves in the mountains where I can shelter either from the weather or from